All right, buckle up, everyone, because today on the deep dive, we are going deep into some uncharted territory. We're talking about what happens when the most powerful person in the country, the President of the United States, bumps up against the law.
It's a fascinating area, really. At the heart of it is this question. How do we balance the immense power of the presidency with the fundamental idea that nobody, not even the president, is above the law?
We've got a mountain of legal cases, historical analysis, all sorts of stuff to sift through today.
Yeah, we'll be digging into those, and we're not just going to look at what happened, but why it matters. What do these legal battles tell us about the balance of power in our government? What are the stakes here?
And to really bring this to life, we're going to examine some really interesting cases, some big names, too. Nixon, Clinton, even a recent case involving Trump's tax returns. It gets pretty juicy,
It
folks.
does, it does. And we'll uncover some twists and turns along the way. This is not your typical dry legal analysis. This is about power, accountability, and the ongoing struggle to uphold the rule of law in this country.
Exactly. So to kick things off, let's start with the basics. Our source gives us a really helpful overview of when a president can actually be subpoenaed or sued. It's actually not as straightforward as you might think.
No, it's not as simple as you can sue anyone.
Mhm.
There are very specific circumstances, very specific limits that apply to the president.
Right. Our source breaks it all down into five main types of presidential litigation, each with its own set of rules. It's like a legal playbook for, dealing with the president.
I like that. A legal playbook. It's a strategic game, almost like a chess match, with both sides trying to make the right moves within the boundaries of the law.
Okay, I love that analogy. All right, let's play it. Let's jump right in with the first type of litigation, subpoena for official duties in a federal criminal case. And of course, we have to start with the big one, the case that really set the stage for all of this. U.S. v. Nixon.
Ugh, Watergate. That name still echoes. This case was all about executive privilege. That's the idea that the president needs a certain level of confidentiality to do their job effectively. But what happens when that confidentiality clashes with a criminal investigation?
Right, Nixon was desperately trying to keep those Watergate tapes secret, claiming executive privilege, but the Supreme Court basically said, nope, not so fast, Mr. President.
And that's what's so important about this case. The Supreme Court acknowledged that executive privilege exists, but they said it's not absolute. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It has to be balanced against the need for justice.
So in this case, the need for evidence in a criminal trial outweighed Nixon's claim of confidentiality. They basically drew a line in the sand and said, even the president can't hide behind executive privilege when there's a legitimate need for evidence.
And it wasn't just about Nixon. It was about setting a precedent for the future. This case established a really crucial principle. Even the president is subject to the rule of law. No one is above the law. It's a cornerstone of our entire system of checks and balances.
Wow. Yeah, you can really see the ripple effects. And it really raises the question, how do you ensure government transparency while also protecting legitimate confidentiality? Like, where's the line?
Yeah, it's a constant tension, a balancing act that the courts are constantly trying to figure out.
Okay, well, let's move on to the second type of litigation, civil claim for official actions. And the big case here is Nixon v. Fitzgerald. This one gets into absolute immunity for the president.
Right, so this case grapples with whether a president can be held personally liable for actions they take as president. And the Supreme Court said, yes, there needs to be some level of immunity to allow the president to effectively do their job.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if the president was constantly worried about being sued for every decision they made. It would paralyze the office.
Exactly. It's not about giving the president a free pass. It's about protecting the institution of the presidency, making sure they can make tough calls without fear of personal liability for everything they do.
Makes sense. But this raises another question, right? What about actions taken before someone becomes president? Do they still get immunity for things that happened before they took office?
Good question. And that leads us right into our third category. Civil claim for pre-presidency actions. The case that everyone points to here is Clinton v. Paula Jones. And this one got everyone's attention.
Well, it definitely did. A bit of a scandal, to say the least.
To say the least. Paula Jones accused Bill Clinton of sexual harassment stemming from an incident that allegedly occurred before he became president. And the Supreme Court ruled that the case could move forward even while Clinton was in office.
No escaping the past, even for the president. So no presidential shield for actions before taking office. That's a pretty important distinction.
Absolutely. It really underlines that idea that no one is above the law,
Right.
regardless of their current position. And again, we see that balancing act the courts have to do. They allowed the case to move forward, but said it couldn't interfere with Clinton's ability to carry out his presidential duties.
Mhm.
Talk about a tricky situation.
Okay, let's move on to type 4. Subpoena in a state criminal case not related to official duties. And the case that comes to mind here is Trump v. Vance.
Yeah, this was an interesting one. This involved the Manhattan district attorney who subpoenaed Trump's financial records for a state criminal investigation. Trump's lawyers argued that he had immunity as president, even in a state case.
But the Supreme Court said, hold on, not so fast. They made it clear that the president doesn't get a blanket exemption from state criminal investigations just because they're president.
And this case really highlights the balance between state and federal authorities. The court was very careful to say that while the president isn't above the law, state investigations can't be used to harass or obstruct the president from doing their job.
So it's a delicate dance. The president has to comply with legal requests, but the courts also have to make sure those requests are legit and not just politically motivated.
Right, exactly. It's about protecting the integrity of both the presidency and the legal process.
All right, on to the final type of litigation. This one is congressional subpoena for personal financial information. And we've got another Trump case here, Trump v. Mazars USA. This one feels particularly relevant given, everything going on these days.
Yeah, this one really gets to the heart of Congress's power. The Supreme Court ultimately said that Congress does have the power to subpoena a president's personal financial records, but there's some very important caveats.
So Congress can't just go on a fishing expedition. They can't just demand to see the president's tax returns for no reason.
Exactly. They have to have a legitimate legislative purpose. They have to show a clear connection between what they're asking for and their actual legislative goals.
So the court set up some pretty specific rules, pretty high hurdles. They really emphasize that the subpoena has to be as narrow as possible, and the burden on the president has to be minimal.
Right. It's all about protecting the president from undue harassment from Congress. It's another example of how the courts act as a check on power, making sure that one branch of government isn't abusing its authority for political gain.
So we've walked through these 5 types of presidential litigation, and it's pretty clear that the courts have a massive role to play in navigating these complex situations. But there's another layer to this whole power dynamic that we need to unpack: the non-delegation doctrine.
Yes. This one is fascinating. We're talking about the limit of Congress's ability to delegate its lawmaking power to the executive branch. Think about it. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to create laws, but they can't possibly oversee every single detail of how those laws are put into practice.
Yeah, no way Congress could micromanage every single agency and program in the government.
Exactly. So they have to rely on the executive branch to actually execute those laws. But that's where this non-delegation doctrine comes in. It's all about making sure that when Congress hands over some of its authority, they do it with clear guidelines. They can't just give the executive branch a blank check and say, figure it out.
Our source uses this great analogy. It's like Congress providing instructions for building a house. Congress sets the overall plan, the blueprint, but the executive branch has some room to figure out the specifics of the construction.
I love that analogy. It's helpful.
Oh.
But as you can imagine, there's a ton of debate about what constitutes a clear enough blueprint. And that's where the courts come in.
They get to decide if Congress went too far.
Right. They have to determine whether Congress provided enough guidelines or whether they just gave away too much of their lawmaking power.
Okay, that is a cliffhanger. I'm definitely ready to dive into this non-delegation doctrine and all of the cases that go with it, but we are going to have to save that for part 2 of this deep dive.
Sounds good. We'll pick it up there. All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty major legal showdowns involving the president, cases that really highlight how even the most powerful office in the land is still bound by the law.
Yeah, those 5 types of litigation we went through were fascinating, and it's clear that the courts have had to, draw some lines in the sand. But now I'm really curious about this non-delegation doctrine. It seems like it gets to the core of how power is shared and, well, how our government actually works.
Absolutely. It really does. It's essentially about the limits on Congress's ability to, hand over some of his lawmaking power to the executive branch. Think of it like this. The Constitution says Congress gets to make the laws, but they can't possibly oversee every single detail of how those laws actually get implemented.
Right, right. It would be impossible for Congress to, micromanage every agency and every program in the entire government.
Yeah.
They have to rely on the executive branch to actually put those laws into action.
Exactly, exactly. But that's where the non-delegation doctrine comes in. It's about making sure that when Congress delegates that authority, they do it with clear guidelines and limits. They can't just give the executive branch a blank check and say, go nuts.
You know, our source uses this analogy about building a house. I love this. It's like Congress provides the blueprint, the overall design, but the executive branch has some leeway in figuring out, the specifics of how to actually build it.
That's a really helpful image. But as you can imagine, there's always a lot of debate about what constitutes a clear enough blueprint. And that's where, guess who? The courts come in.
They get to be the referees.
Exactly. They have to decide. Has Congress provided enough guidance, or have they basically just given up their lawmaking responsibilities?
So let's look at some specific cases. Our source points to a couple of really early examples from way back in 1935, Schechter Poultry v. U.S. and Panama Refining Co. v. Ryan. It seems like these cases really set the stage for how we understand this doctrine.
They really do. In both cases, the Supreme Court struck down laws because they gave the president too much, open-ended authority. So in Schechter Poultry, the National Industrial Recovery Act gave the president this broad power to regulate industry codes. And the court said, whoa, hold on. Congress didn't give enough specific instructions here. They basically gave the president the ability to make laws, which is, Congress's job.
So it was like a power grab by the executive branch that the court shut down.
That's a good way to put it. The court was really concerned about protecting the separation of powers. They saw this broad delegation of authority as a threat to that balance that's so carefully outlined in the Constitution.
And what about Panama Refining? Was it a similar situation?
Yeah, very similar. In that case, the president was given the power to prohibit the transportation of oil that was produced, in violation of state quotas. And again, the court said, nope, Congress didn't provide enough guidance. They emphasized this idea of an intelligible principle. Basically, Congress has to give clear standards and limitations when they delegate their authority.
It's like those cases really set the ground rules. The court was saying, hey, Congress, you can delegate, but you can't just abdicate your responsibility.
Exactly, exactly. But like most things in law, it's not always that simple. Things have evolved over time. As the world's gotten more complex, the court has recognized that Congress needs more flexibility to delegate to agencies that have, specialized expertise. They can't be experts in everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the government today is dealing with some incredibly complicated stuff, from like regulating the financial markets to tackling climate change. Congress can't be expected to know all the ins and outs of every single issue.
Right, right. And that leads us to a more recent case that shows this evolution in thinking. Whitman v. American Trucking Associations. This one was decided in 2001 and involved the Clean Air Act. Congress had given the EPA the authority to set air quality standards, which, as you can imagine, is a very, very complex process.
Oh, yeah, I bet. You've got science and economics and all sorts of policy judgments to consider.
Exactly. Congress can't possibly micromanage all of that. And the Supreme Court agreed. They upheld the EPA's authority, saying that Congress had given enough guidance in the Clean Air Act.
So even though the Clean Air Act didn't spell out every single detail of how the EPA should do its job, the court said, look, this is within the bounds of the non-delegation doctrine.
Exactly. And this case really highlights that constant tension, balancing the need for Congress to delegate to agencies that have specialized knowledge, while also making sure those agencies are staying within the limits that Congress set.
So how do the courts actually decide where to draw that line? What are the things they look at when they're trying to figure out if a delegation of power is constitutional or not?
It's a great question, and one that legal scholars still debate all the time. The court looks at a lot of factors, like the level of detail that Congress provided, the scope of the power that was given away, and the potential for, abuse of that power.
It's definitely nuanced and complicated. No easy answers.
Nope, no easy answers. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that balance between giving agencies the flexibility to actually do their jobs effectively, but also making sure they're not, overstepping their bounds.
Well, this whole discussion of the non-delegation doctrine has been incredibly insightful. It's so interesting to see how this one principle plays out in all these different cases and how it really shapes the relationship between Congress and the president.
And, this tension, this push and pull between the different branches of government, it's really at the heart of our system of checks and balances.
It really makes you think about how this doctrine might apply to current debates about government power and regulation. It's like a whole new way to understand these power struggles.
Absolutely. And this is a principle that, well, it's never really settled. It continues to be debated and challenged in court cases all the time. It's a living part of our democracy.
We've covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? Legal limits on the president, the non-delegation doctrine. My brain is full.
Mine too. It's been quite a journey through all the complexities of our constitutional system.
But we're not done yet. We've got one more part to go. In part 3, we'll take a closer look at how these frameworks actually play out in today's political landscape. Real-world examples, current challenges. It's going to be good.
Welcome back, everyone. You know, we've been digging deep into some pretty heady stuff, exploring the legal boundaries that even the president has to operate within and, untangling this whole idea of the non-delegation doctrine. But what I keep coming back to is just how much this actually affects us all, in our everyday lives.
It really does. We've been talking about landmark cases and big legal principles, but it's not just abstract theory. It's the framework for how power actually functions in our government.
Yeah, we've gone through presidential power, Congress, all sorts of stuff. It's like we covered, I don't know, centuries of legal battles. But what I'm really curious about is how this connects to, the stuff we see in the headlines every day. That's the key question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. Now let's bring it all home. Think about the really hot-button issues we're facing right now. Immigration, climate change, all the economic regulations, even national security.
The stuff that's constantly in the news.
Right, the stuff that everyone's talking about, debating, fighting over.
The issues that really shape the political landscape.
And behind all of that, you've got these legal frameworks that we've been talking about. Take climate change as an example, right? Congress passes a law, like the Clean Air Act, but then they give authority to an agency like the EPA to actually implement the law and, create specific regulations.
Yeah, because Congress can't be expected to, understand every scientific detail or every economic implication of those regulations.
They can't be experts on everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, did Congress give enough direction? Did they give the EPA too much power? And boom, that's where the non-delegation doctrine kicks in. So those debates that we hear all the time, is the EPA overreaching? Is Congress just passing the buck? That's all rooted in these constitutional principles that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And it's the courts that often end up having to be the referee in these disputes. They have to decide whether the delegation of authority was constitutional, whether the agency's actually staying within the lines.
It's like this constant back and forth, isn't it? Congress wants to give broad authority. Agencies want to use that authority to actually get things done, and then the courts have to come in and make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
And it's not just about some technical legal argument. These decisions have real consequences.
Yeah.
They affect the environment, the products we can buy, our national
It
security.
affects our lives.
Exactly. It affects our life. So understanding these principles, it's not just for lawyers and judges, it's for everyone. It's about being informed, engaged citizens, understanding how power really works in our government.
And it's about being able to, join these debates, participate in a way that actually makes sense.
Right. So the next time you hear someone arguing that the government is overreaching or that Congress isn't doing its job, think about what we've talked about. What authority did Congress actually give away?
Yeah.
What are the limits of that power? What did the courts say? It gives you a way to think critically, analyze the issues, and form your own opinions.
I love that. It's like giving people the tools they need to really understand what's going on.
That's what's so exciting about this stuff. It's not just about memorizing cases. It's about understanding the power dynamics in our democracy and how they affect us all.
Something that really stuck with me is this realization that, this tension, this constant negotiation of power, it's not a mistake. It's built into the system.
It's by design. That's such a good point. The founders of this country created this system with checks and balances, with overlapping powers, because they didn't want any one person or any one part of the government to have too much control.
And it's messy and it's complicated and it never seems to end. But it's also pretty amazing that this whole system has actually worked, for centuries.
It really is. It's a testament to, how much thought and care went into creating our system of government. And it's up to all of us to make sure it keeps working, to debate these issues and make sure our government truly serves the people.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of, awe and also responsibility. Awe at just how complex and well-designed our system is, but also a responsibility to understand it, to engage with it, to make sure it keeps functioning the way it was intended to.
I think that's a great way to put it. And remember, this conversation is never really over. Things are always changing, new challenges are always emerging. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
Well said. And who knows, maybe someone listening right now will be the next legal scholar or the next Supreme Court justice, grappling with these issues, shaping the future of our democracy. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.